All right. Thanks for being here today. Among other things, a writer and reader. And we talked about how to pronounce your name, and I said I was going to mess it up, and I probably will. But Alastair Henry, is
That's
that
correct?
how?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
there you
that's
go.
fine.
How long did the book you wrote, "The Soldier and the Orphan," ruminate in your mind before you began writing it?
A couple of years, actually. I was writing memoirs. I wrote an autobiography, and then I co-wrote 3 memoirs. And at that point, I didn't think I'd ever write a novel, but I started to get this idea that the world had changed, and it would be nice to write a novel incorporating early childhood memories. And that's really what it was all about. And I became aware of another situation in Canada called the Home Children, which was a diabolical scheme between the Canadian government and the British government that wasn't taught in schools, like the Indian residential school thing. Wasn't taught in schools, and then the government wanted to forget about it. But over 120,000 children between the ages of 3 and 13 were shipped from British homes and orphanages to Canada to work as domestics and farm workers. Can you believe that? On a 5-year contract without their consent, because
What
Canada,
time frame was that?
1890 to 1950. Canada needed labor, and this got rid of a big problem in Britain, because in those days there was no family planning. People were having 14 kids, 16 kids. Times were tough. They couldn't feed them. They used to just drop them off at a church. So the British government started to build orphanages and big homes run by mostly religious societies, especially the Catholics and the Church of England. So this got rid of that problem for them. They shipped 120,000 to Canada, so now they didn't have to feed them and clothe them. Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to, I made one of the characters in my book an orphan that is shipped to Canada when he's 13.
Okay. Did that type of thing happen around the world during that time, or is it just specific to Britain and Canada?
It's a British colonial thing. They did it they shipped these kids to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Yeah. You weren't aware of that, eh?
Well, they don't teach you that in American schools. We learn a lot about Jamestown and things like that. So
yeah.
I've done a lot of research on the transatlantic slave trade in like the 1770s to like 1815 time frame, just for a book I'm still working on. But
well, you see, many of these kids were treated terribly. Some were okay, but some of them were treated terribly and scarred for life. And many of them, when they were 18 and they left the farm or whatever, they were embarrassed that they were home. It was called home children. So they never talked about it. So a lot of people in Canada don't know that. And yet it's a big part of Canada's history, and, their contribution should be recognized.
Is that about the time frame of Oliver Twist?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did they end up dealing with it in Britain? Did they start doing more family planning, or just less kids, or what happened?
No, just times had changed, contraceptives had come in and things like this. It was just a natural evolution, if you like.
How did you first start collecting the information for writing that?
Well, I came to Canada when I was 19 by myself on a boat out of Liverpool. to Quebec City. And then I was in a boarding house, and there was 2 Australians there. And I have a great memory, TR. I don't know why, but anyway, there were 2 Australians there, Peter and Colin. And they were from England, but they were shipped to Australia when they were 13. They were Dr. Bernardo boys. So that's when I first became aware. Dr. Bernardo ran a home for, orphans in Britain. And he was part of this scheme. But they all got money, you see. The government, the Canadian and the British government paid the sending agency for sending these kids to Canada. And the farmer who was assigned a child, he had to pay like a finder's fee. So it was all about the money. So Pete and Colin went to Australia. They worked in Australia, and when they were 18, they decided to see the world. And they'd already worked their way through Europe and Asia. And here they were in the same boarding house as me in London, Ontario. And I remember thinking, wow, they're my age, but they never knew their parents or whether they have any brothers or sisters. Wow. And they're so confident. And here they are. I'm really impressed by their independence. So anyway, that stayed with me. So in my book, I made Tommy, one of the brothers, an orphan that came to Canada.
Okay. Then once you started writing it, what was your process for getting all the information together? Which kind of programs did you use?
Just Word, just Microsoft Word. But most of it is, when I think about it, it's autobiographical. I never sat down and said, here's the beginning, here's the middle, and here's the end. I just wanted to. I realized the world had changed since I was a kid growing up in England. And I wanted to incorporate the way things were. And it just flowed. I just had to weave it all together to make it fit. So it's about identical twin boys born in 1921 in Lancashire, England, at a time to an unwed mother, at a time when such a thing was a disgrace. The sins of the father being, put on their children. And the parish priest, Father Shields, wanted to take both boys and put them in an orphanage without anybody knowing, because it was like a secret. When your daughter got pregnant, you didn't let her out of the house because you were embarrassed. You didn't want your neighbors to see that you had a pregnant daughter. So there was a lot of effort put into keeping it a secret. And in this regard, there was a girl about 16 on our street who all of a sudden disappeared. Didn't see her. Then she reappeared about 9 months later with a little baby. And the story was that they were something tragic had happened to the baby's parents. So they were going to adopt this child. But we all knew it was the daughter's child. So that was part of it too, So a lot of it I weaved into there, the heavy-handedness of the church in people's lives. They were all afraid of the priest and, the devil and things like this. So Father Shields comes in and takes one baby and puts him in an orphanage, and he's the baby, Tommy, that ends up being sent to Canada when he's 13. Now, the other boy, Billy, lives with his mum. And then the Second World War comes and he gets conscripted, so he has to go into the war. And he gets injured just towards the end of the war in France. He gets... a bomb explodes and he's got shrapnel, and a nurse called Claire looks after him, and he falls in love with Claire. So that's really the guts of the story. But the story's in 4 parts. part one is like Billy, part two is Mary, the mother, part three is Tommy, and part four is really the coming together and the wrap up.
Okay. When you were writing it, did you have a specific place where you did most of your writing?
Different places. I'm just trying to think back now. And just mostly in my dining room where I'm talking to you now. I used to do it here, but you get into the groove. Well, as a writer, you get into the groove, and it's beautiful. The imagination just cobbles together all sorts and sends you in all sorts of directions, and then you get surprised and say, "Wow, didn't see that coming."
Mm-hmm.
And my parents were from the Channel Islands. Don't know if you ever heard of those.
I have.
Jersey and Guernsey. They're in the
Yep.
English Channel. Well, they were Channel Islands, but then the Germans invaded and occupied the island. So in 1939, my parents were evacuated to Glasgow, Scotland, and they remained there throughout the next 6 years while the Germans occupied the islands. And afterwards, in 1946, my parents returned to the islands, and so that's when I became aware of the war. Some of my relatives didn't leave the islands, and they told me horrific stories about what happened during the war. And those I've incorporated into my book. So in my book, both Tommy and Billy end up in Jersey. That's just the way it worked out, and that's where they were reunited.
When you were in the process of writing it, how long every day did you work on it? Did you have a specific time you set aside to do it, or just when the
No,
moment struck?
I was never that. I wasn't strict with it. I just used to think about it, and then for a while, I talked to my wife about it too. She helped me develop some of the plots and some of the twists and bends. I wrote when I felt I was ready to write, so I didn't force it. I just let it flow. But it was beautiful. I really enjoyed getting into the groove because I like that experience of not knowing where this is going to take you, and
If it was
especially
done
with
in,
some of the dialogue, I get into it, and I'm right there listening to them argue or whatever, and I loved it.
yeah, that's interesting when you have two characters and you just put them in a room, so to speak, and they have a conversation. And sometimes you use that stuff and sometimes you don't, but it's one of those things where the writer always has more in their mind about the story. Like the story is so much bigger to the person who wrote it, and probably to your wife as well, who you've talked to about it while you're writing it, that through the editing process and just condensing it down, you get to these little parts, but there's a lot of backstory that that other people won't know. Do you have other people that you sent parts of it to when you were writing it? Just like I don't know if you'd call it an ideal reader, but just somebody that you thought could look at it and say if it made sense or not? Did you have
Yeah,
somebody?
I'm a member of the London Writers Society. There's about 80 authors or would-be authors. About 40 attend a meeting, a monthly meeting, and then they have a little critique group. So my critique group, I had about 5 or 6 people, and we'd meet once a month and share our writing and get tips about, just constructive criticism. So that was very, very useful.
If you wrote it in parts, did you have one part of it finished before the other, or mainly finished? Like, did you work on the Billy part and then work on the Mary part, or how did you split your time between them?
Yeah, that's interesting. because the story actually spans, well, the children, the boys are born in 1921. So I go right back to 1900 for the birth of their mother, Mary. But when I started to write it, it was just one great big story. But it was complicated. And I was going back and forth. So somewhere in the editing process, I thought, this, I think it makes sense to break it up. This is going to confuse the writer or the reader. It's too, and yet I didn't want to radically change the story. So I broke it in parts. I thought, oh, okay, I'll write Billy's life, then I'll write the mother's life, then I'll write Tommy's life. That makes sense. And a lot of the critique group agreed with that. So that's how it ended up. But it didn't start out as 4 stories. It just was a mishmash as I went back and forth. But I was getting frustrated doing that. And it was very difficult how to seamlessly intertwine 4 stories into one story.
Yeah.
So I'm quite happy with the way it is. But the thing is, it lends itself now to, like a Netflix series, or because it could be in parts and episodes. But I never wrote it that way purposely. That's just the way it ended up. But a lot of people that have read it have said, this really lends itself to being made into a movie.
Yeah, I've never written a whole script before, but I've dabbled in the script writing world, and I think it made my regular fiction writing better because it strips it down even more. Like my regular writing isn't so detailed that it doesn't leave room for the reader to imagine things on their own. You're not describing everything in every little detail to where your book comes out to be 100,000, 120,000 words.
Yeah, really.
You're leaving it air to breathe, but the script writing leaves even more. And I didn't realize before that how different a type of writing is. Like I thought, if you can write a book, then surely you can write a script. And I think that's true. You could write a script, but it's a different type of writing, and you definitely need to practice it to be able to get better at it. And then I like it because it's just so simple. Instead of describing the scene even a little, you just say exterior, night, shopping center. And then there you go. Now you're off into your dialogue. And I like that. I mean, I don't practice it as much as I should, but it is interesting if you thought about doing a script for a book that you wrote, it would be a whole different experience.
Well, the content is rich in that it involves the Channel Islands, the German occupation, because Billy lived through the German occupation, but he wasn't a Channel Islander. So they had to come up with stories that allowed him, were believable, so that the Germans believed that this is the story behind this guy. And then in Canada, Tommy goes to a farm as a domestic laborer. So there we've got this whole British home children thing. And the book starts with Billy in the Second World War being shot and going home with PTSD. So there's a lot of content. It's very rich.
Yeah, even though it's broken into the 4 parts, each part has its own research of that, time frame to weave it into a historical fiction type of thing. Yeah. So it is, as you said before, it tracks and is believable. So yeah, I can see how breaking it down into those pieces made it easier to deal with. Yeah. How far along were you in the story with them all together before you started to separate them?
Well, as I said to you, I didn't really sit down and plot the whole thing out, beginning and middle and an end. I just
Right.
let my imagination take me to wherever. But fortunately, we ended up with a very believable solution ending. So I didn't really know where it was going as I was writing it. I had, well, in part two, Mary, her father is a very religious, well, he's almost fanatical. And he actually sends his daughter Mary to live with an aunt in Jersey because he's concerned about her relationship with a boyfriend. So he sends her to Jersey as a way to break up this relationship because she's only 18. And that's where Mary's now in Jersey, and that's where she gets pregnant. So there's the first part, the Jersey. Tommy goes to Jersey because he decides to go to England, but home children weren't given a passport or a birth certificate. So he leaves Canada to go back to England to find his birth parents and whatever, but they wouldn't let him in because he didn't have a passport, a birth certificate. So he ended up in Jersey. He just got on a boat and went to Jersey and found some work. So that's why he's in Jersey. Now, the other guy, Tommy, who goes to Quebec, he's working on a farm, a dairy farm. And there's 2 Jersey cows among the other Holsteins. But he particularly likes these Jersey cows. And that's how he ends up going to Jersey, because he has a connection with the Jersey cows. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how those little things come up in stories. Do you find that you did like a first draft, or you get the basic story down and then go back and connect all those little dots, or
Yeah.
did it put itself together on the way?
No, I probably rewrote it 8 or 9 times. Yeah.
How'd
I
you
mean,
determine?
deleting stuff where you think, this is really, it's confusing the reader and it doesn't really add anything.
Right.
So I was really just chopping and keeping everything really pertinent to the storylines.
Yeah, that's those little pieces where you get questions from people that have read the book later on, and they say, well, what happened to this character about this thing? And it's something you already thought about and may have even written about it, but you just took it out because it didn't advance the story or didn't make the final edit. And then you have this ready-made story for them. I like it when those happen. But
what I
when
wanted
you're
to do too was to show in the book how friendship, compassion, empathy played a role in the lives of my protagonists. So, for instance, when Billy returns to England, he's got PTSD. He's living on the street, Salvation Army hostel. But then he meets a friend from school who has pity on him and says, I got a job and somewhere you can live, Billy. So he gives him a job as a rag and bone man. Now, you probably never heard of a rag and bone man.
Oh, I know it. Right? Go around and get people's leftover stuff.
Yeah, but at the end of the war, like during the war in England, every piece of metal was given to the government to be made into planes, guns, whatever. So there's a real shortage of metal, and people were very poor. So these rag and bone men went around and collected everything. They collected metals, woolens, cloth, and it was all being made into, it was called shoddy. So they would process all these cotton. I mean, today we just make everything out of virgin wood or something.
Mm-hmm.
But they were reprocessing the cottons and coming up with the material and making new shirts. So Billy was a rag and bone man, and then he met this lady he was wearing his cap from the army, and one of the old ladies on his route recognized the cap, and she said, "Oh, that was my husband was in that army." So that's how they struck up that friendship. But it turned out that she lived on the same street as Billy when he was little. So she told him, "No, your mum had twins. You have a brother." So it's a very powerful, emotive script.
When you moved from England to Canada, would you think about how big the countries were, how different the size of Canada was to Britain?
Well, that's the thing, TR. When Tommy, in my book, when Tommy comes to Canada, I used my own recollection of what it was like, because I came when I was 19 by boat, and I wasn't first class. I bought the cheapest ticket, so I was way down in the bowels of the ship. Horrible, the smell of the engine oil and all the noise. So I used that experience to describe. And then when I got to Canada, I went by train from Quebec City to London, Ontario. And I remember looking out across all the green fields, how big, how vast, the bridges, the river, and I used all of that to describe Tommy's observations. So, when you do that, there's an authenticity that sort of shines through, because it's not the imagination talking, it's a real life experience. And that happens a lot. Like when I go to Jersey, in the book, of course, we went back to Jersey a couple of times. Well, we lived in Guernsey, but we went back a couple of times. And so my memory of the islands are very rich, and that's what I use to describe what it was like in Jersey. Like in Jersey at the time, there were no house numbers. Every house had a name, like Petit, whatever, Petit Saint-Michel, Maison Petit. And that, I remember thinking, wow, that's kind of cute, that is so personal. So,
Yeah, you get a lot of that in beach communities in the U.S. too, where it just has the name of the house, but it still has the address number. But then they also have the names.
Yeah.
How did you get into doing the voiceover work then?
Well, I did 2 books, Awakening in the Northwest Territories. That was my first book. And I got to tell you about that, TR, because that's interesting. How did I become an author? Well, by chance. I never set out to be an author. I went to live when I retired at 57 because I could. But 2 years later, I was asking myself, is this it? Is this all I'm going to do? Play golf? God, it's not enough, I wasn't fulfilled. But I didn't want to go back in the city. I didn't want to go back in the corporate world. I realized I needed some sort of adventure, something different. So believe it or not, I came up with this opportunity to go to live for 2 years with a small First Nations band, like indigenous band.
Mm-hmm.
What would you call them in the US?
Same thing, First Nation. My generation would probably call them Indians.
Yeah.
Just because that's what we were raised with. But Native American, Native Canadian, natives.
Yeah.
It always was interesting to me because if you're Native, that means you were born there. So am I not Native American also if I'm born in America? No. I know there's a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a small 300 Chippewan hamlet on a fly-in location on the east arm of Great Slave Lake, totally isolated, and it's above the 60th parallel. So everything up there is different. The land, It's above the tree line. So the whole geography of the place. And of course, the community was never, I mean, I grew up, I'm a product of really, Ontario. I'm Canadian, got Canadian values. But even though I was still in Canada, man, they were so different. Their worldview, their spirituality, and it really impacted me. But anyway, the thing is, when I went there, my daughter said, "Here's a journal, Dad. I want you to write in this because we know it's going to be so different up there than it is down here." And that was it. That was the start of my writing career. So I wrote in it initially out of a sense of obligation, because I thought, she's going to say, "How's the writing coming, Dad?" And I didn't want to say, I'll start it soon. So I got to writing. But so much was happening. It was such a strange world. I wanted to document it all. So I finished the journal in about 3 weeks, and then I started writing in notebooks. And I carried on all the way through the 2 years I was there. And I ended up with these 8 notebooks. And I decided to leave there. And I thought, well, I can't just turn this lot over to my daughter and say, "Here, read this." I thought I got to make some sense out of it, So the universe sent me this idea, really weird, to go to a place and put all of this stuff into Word and rework it and see what you come up with. So I rented a little guest house in Coita, Costa Rica, and I went there for a month. And every morning I'd get up and feverishly I'd type in all this stuff. And I had about 400,000 words, Wow. And then I started to go through, and I realized a lot of it didn't go anywhere. So, got rid of that. But then there was other stuff that was developing over a period of weeks, months. So I left that in and just carried on writing. And the weird thing, TR, is as I was writing, I noticed how I had changed. So in the beginning, in the early days, when Joe came in and said, "Can I run something by you?" I said to him, "Hell no. I'm not your personal counselor. I'm the financial guy here. Leave me alone, And 2 years later, it's like, "How can I help you, Joe?" So it was this whole transformation that I realized helping people made me happy. That was the fulfillment that I got. I didn't get that in the corporate world, because in the corporate world, it was always meetings and budgets and reports. But up there, because I was an outsider, people talked to me and shared. They thought they trusted me, that they could tell me things and ask my advice. And that's what really made me feel good. So that's how I started my writing.
When you were up there for the 2 years, did you know you were going to be there for 2 years? Did you think you were going to be there longer or less time?
It was an open-ended. I was hired full-time, but after 2 years, I just felt it was time to move on. But by that time, I realized, that I like to help people. Like I had a Visa card. Nobody else had a Visa card. It looks okay. There's nothing. There's a co-op store. There's no bank, no coffee shop, no donut shop, nothing. And it's $250 to fly to Yellowknife. So most people didn't. So when they got a check, because they worked on it as a fire crew or on the ice road or something, they would go to the co-op to cash it. But the co-op only had so much money. So a lot of times the co-op had to say, "Sorry, come back tomorrow." So people were walking around with checks and no money to buy anything. So I was helping out, buying things on Visa, like camping gear and stuff from Yellowknife, having it shipped in, and I would just take it out of their pay, because I had their payroll. So when I finished writing this book for my daughter, I gave it to her. I called it White Man on the Land, and she gave it to other people. and everybody really enjoyed it. But they said, the reader would like to know who was this man that went to Lutz OK, and what did he do after? So I carried on writing all the way back, and it became an autobiography called Awakening in the Northwest Territories, because it was a really rude awakening. Here I was at 60, felt that I had a good handle on life, and here I go, and it upsets the way I look at the world and what's important and values, and because I'd always been about success. I mean, that was the whole thing with my colleagues. We were all about being successful. And then we realized that when I was up there, it's not about success. It's about being happy. What's the point of being successful if you're not happy? So that was a real turnaround in my life.
Well, you can be successful and not happy, and you just use the success to cover up the fact you're not happy.
Yeah.
Travel is an interesting thing of how it expands. It does expand what you think about things. And in the military, I always thought, I still do, that the military has a way of taking nice places and making them not so nice just to experience. Like going to Paris Island, it's probably a really beautiful place if you're not there in boot camp. But I don't have the desire to go back because I was there in boot camp. And then there were some things I got to do that I got to choose to do when I was in the military. And one of those was go to Alaska for a reserve rotation. I was in the Marine Reserves, and it was supposed to be 2 weeks. And I think it got extended to something like 21 days going to Galena, which is a place where the Iditarod goes through. I'm not sure if it still goes through there, but there's an old Air Force base there that is in caretaker status. So it's not a military base anymore per se. It's run by civilians, but that's where we flew into out of Fairbanks after we loaded the C-1s and went out there to do a thing called Arctic Care, where it takes doctors, veterinarians, some other people out to the villages in Alaska that don't normally have roads to them. So I guess a similar situation, not quite, there are trees there, so it's not above the tree line. I have been to Barrow, Alaska, and there weren't trees really there. But in Galena, there's like Calcasieu and Caltag, and I get the Alaskan villages mixed up with Louisiana parishes sometimes. So forgive me if I say the wrong name, but it does make you think differently about the world when you see how people live differently. And I understand your explanation of there's not enough money to go around, like for people to cash their checks, because that was one of the issues in Galena when I was there was no ATMs. You had to go to this bar across the airstrip that had an ATM, but it wasn't really an ATM. It was a store or a bar that you could charge money and they would give you the cash for it, but they only had a limited amount of cash. So interesting when you start to take for granted living in what we would call modern civilization.
Yeah.
Before you said you were a product or like had the morality, or I'm not sure the exact words, of growing up in Ontario. Where were you when you were 10 years old? If you go back to the idea of, I think there's a personality test, or some psychologist came up with the idea that what you are is where you were when you were 10.
Yeah.
That your morality and view of the world is pretty much set when you're 10 years old. So were you back in Britain then, and do you see a reflection on those values versus Canadian values?
Yeah, well, I was born in Glasgow, and we went we went to Guernsey when I was 1 year old. But when I was 5, we moved to England because my mother had a bad heart. And the doctor said, pushing a pram up and down hill is not good for you. You've got to find some flatter land. So she had a sister living in Bolton, Lancashire. And her sister said, come here, the land is fine, So we ended up in Bolton, Lancashire. but that was a cotton mill town. It was very dirty because everything was coal-fired. The climate is very wet because that's it's just so geographically where it's situated. So it's a very dull, grey, dreary. Now, people from Bolton wouldn't like me to say that, but compared to Canada, so it was drab. And the Catholic Church. I went to a Catholic school with a Sister Dolorita, was a very, very strict headmistress. And then I went to Thornley Salesian College, which was another branch of Catholic, all run by brothers and priests. So it's very strict. So I would say the religious aspect figures in my book too, because it was a big thing when I was growing up. It was all about the devil and living in fear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to a Catholic college myself. Not as strict as what you went to, but I was disappointed that the nuns did not wear habits. I was very disappointed. They were just regular people.
Yeah. So this is why, and it was just after the Second World War. I mean, this is before things got going and the economy flourished. Life was hard, really. It was very, very difficult for my parents. Everybody was just eking out a living. And that's what I remember, the hardships. We had a pram. Well, there was a pram left over from my baby brother. And we used to go and fill it with coal bricks. And all the three of us children pushed the pram home. Oh, man, because it was all coal-fired. There was no central heating or even water. We had to light a roaring fire in the fireplace because the water heater was behind. And that's where the hot water came. So you couldn't have a bath until you had a great big fire. Oh, man. And that's why I think, the way things are today, man, we're so fortunate. And that's why I wanted to build that stuff into my book, how we've sort of evolved. Life is a lot better. We don't have to worry about those things. We just flick a switch and we got instant heat, good water.
Yeah. For some people, anyway. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
It is you do have to stop every now and then and realize how lucky you are.
Yeah. Now, after when I left the North, I went to Bangladesh for 2 years. I volunteered to work with a small NGO that was helping putting microcredit programs into rural villages and coastal villages. And that was a really rude awakening too there. And that's when I realized, the rickshaw wallah, people down there had no aspirations to be anything else. It's just the way the world is different. They're a rickshaw wallah. The dad was a rickshaw wallah. The grandfather was. That they just said, we're rickshaw wallahs. Because one time I went to a public washroom and man, it was gross. It was all concrete, smelled to high heaven. And there was a guy in there with a mop mopping the floor, and he was whistling. And I thought, my God, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. And I thought, he's in there washing the floors. But the thing is, he has a job. His satisfaction comes when he goes home to his family. And that's the way it is. It's the community, the children, the elders. That's where their happiness comes from. In my world, it's different. We go bowling or we go to watch a football game or whatever. But in their world of no money, it's all relatives and they're happy. And I noticed when I was on the bus, people were singing. I thought, wow. And everybody joins in. Amazing. Eh? So happiness is a state of mind. That's what I realized. It's not what you have.
How did you, when you travel, how do you pick the places that you travel to?
Well, that was an assignment. It was a 1 year, and it was a 2 year assignment in Bangladesh with a British organization called VSO, Volunteer Services Overseas. And in Canada, we have something similar. It's called CUSO, Canada University Services Overseas. And it's a little bit like your US, what would your program be? Where you send people?
The Peace Corps. I don't know.
Peace Corps, yeah.
Okay.
It's like that. It's part of Canada's international development efforts. So it sends people, and it paid my flight, gives me enough to my accommodation, a little bit of money to cover food and local transport. So it doesn't cost you anything out of your own pocket. So,
Is there just through traveling, I've thought about this, so I'll ask you the question. Is there a way that you, or a question that you could ask to a culture that you could get a good feeling of what that culture was like? Any idea on, like, an example for mine is how they treat women. So if I was going to travel somewhere that I chose to go, I would say, well, how do they treat women? Can my wife walk around without covering her head or her face? Am I going to get in trouble there as an American because I'm going to see something that I think is not right? And if I say something about it, am I going to end up in a Turkish prison or
yeah,
something? So
yeah.
so I think about that when I think about travel, because my wife wants to go a lot of different places. And from my view of traveling through the US and some parts of the world with the military, that I mean, the more I travel, the more I like the US. But is there a question that you ask yourself when you think about going somewhere that you can determine if it's safe for you to go, or what you think the predominant attitude towards humanity is?
Mhm.
It's a difficult question.
Well, I think my overall concern would be safety. Is it safe? Like after Bangladesh, my wife and I went to Kingston, Jamaica for a year. Now, Kingston is the murder capital of the world, but it's Jamaicans killing Jamaicans. In our whole year that we were there, and we went everywhere, a couple of times, I rented a car because family came in, children came in, grandchildren came in. I rented a car for the week and went right around the island. And, everybody, they respect tourists and they understand tourists are vital to the economy. And the other thing is, if you mess with a tourist, man, the cops will make sure you have a hard time. So it was amazing. We were always extended the greatest courtesy. We were never in fear. And then we did another year in Georgetown, Guyana. And the same thing there. People were very respectful, very helpful. They were just pleased that we were in their country to help. We were working with youth organizations, but not religious. This is part of just the Canadian effort to make a difference. But we used common sense. I think I wasn't flashing my Rolex watch, and we made sure that in the evening we weren't in bars late and being obvious. But we never had a problem in all of our travels.
Yeah, places like that depend on tourism so much are interesting because it's like the government knows what they need to do to keep people safe, but they just
Mhm.
won't do it for their own people. And you're like,
No.
oh, what's going on there? So it makes me, like, when we went to Peru and Ecuador recently, or within a year back,
Mm,
and there
beautiful.
was problems going on in Ecuador. I mean, the country's nice, but there are parts of it, and there's parts of the U.S. that you wouldn't want to go. But there's, I don't know. It does make me think that if the government knows what the deal is, why don't they make it right for everybody? But I was listening to the Beach Boys the other day, and while the Beach Boys wasn't like growing up, I think that was what my parents were listening to. But because my parents were listening to it, that's the stuff we listened to when we were growing up. We listened to like Beach Boy albums, so I remember all the albums. I wasn't around when they first came out, really, but we listened to them all, so I'm familiar with the Beach Boys. And I was thinking, listening to one of the songs, I can't remember the exact one, the one where the I could sing it, but that's not going to help. Where the lady has the her dad's car and she's driving around and going to the hamburger stand and all that, and you think, wow, what kind of country would make music like this? And I think it's different than the America then is different than the America now, because I don't think that's as popular in music. Maybe you have like some Jimmy Buffett type music or beach music that's like that, but I mean, the Taliban is not going to allow the Beach Boys in Afghanistan. So that's the type of questions I would ask myself as far as, how they treat women. And then now another question I would say is, do they listen to the Beach Boys? And then if that's I'm going to go. So it's interesting to think about when you travel.
For the most part, like in Bangladesh, they live in a very small world. They live in Bangladesh. And most Bangladeshis really aren't that familiar with the rest of the world. I mean, it's poor. They haven't got the news coverage or whatever. So they live almost traditionally, and, with those values about men and women and children. But I found, amazingly, the community to be very strong and the children to be very respectful, particularly of the elders. And in their cultures, the elders are really given great respect. Whereas in my culture, we put our old people in retirement homes, get them out of the way. We're too busy. Yeah, just differences.
When you travel, do you take more than one bag, or are you a one bag traveler? I know you did some backpacking.
Yeah, one bag. 25 pounds.
Okay. Yeah, that was the rule on our recent trip to Peru and Ecuador. Was one of the planes you could only have one piece of luggage that was 25 pounds or less. Of course, they gave it to you in kilograms, and I had to do the conversion. But
well, so long as you travel like longitudinal, where the weather doesn't change much. So, I mean, we always, all our backpacking, it was to beaches and things like this. So, you needed very few clothes. We just washed them out in the sink, hung them up. They were dry in the morning, rolled them up, put them back in the backpack, and off we went. So you don't need a lot of stuff. So when you're backpacking, it's, you don't really care. You just need some clean clothes. That's all.
Yeah, it is interesting how much we accrue in life, and then how much you really need. That's why one of the things I liked about the military was you could fit everything in a sea bag or two, and that's all you had. You didn't have to worry about, did you forget anything? Because if you didn't have it, you didn't have it.
Yeah.
And then later in life, when we moved from the East Coast to the West Coast of the US, that when you live in a house for a certain amount of years, you just accrue stuff and stuff and stuff. And then you start to sort through it and go, well, I've never used this. So, you start to pare down a lot. And we lived in an RV for a year traveling around the US, which was
Wow.
a great way to see the country. And we didn't have anything. We had a small storage unit that had some furniture in it back in Tacoma in Washington. And then everything else we owned was with us. So
Yeah.
if you couldn't forget it because you didn't have it if you didn't have it. And
Yeah.
I really like that way of living. And then since then, and moving maybe about 12 times in as many years, the more you move, the better you get at saying, okay, I'm not going to use that. I'm not going to use that. I'm not going to use that. And then I do appreciate traveling with one bag and
Oh,
having those limits on it. I mean, if you're going to somewhere like Antarctica, you're going to need more because you got to have all the big clothes as you were talking about. But yeah, I think that's the thing. The best thing I like about traveling is taking less stuff and just seeing how little
well, you
you can
feel
take.
light, eh? You feel
Yeah.
light. Yeah. Now, when I went to Lutz, I only had a knife and a fork, a plate and a cup. And that's it, because that's all I had. And I thought, well, that's all I need. It's weird. But when I have a meal, how many plates do you need? If you have a drink, how many cups do you need? How many, you know? And it was the same thing when I went to Bangladesh. Had very little. So I learned to be a minimalist. And I realized we don't need much, really. So,
It's when you don't have a lot and you think about things like you don't have stuff because you can't afford it. And then you're like, well, I really would like this other thing. And then when you get the money or the ability to get it, and then you have it and you're like, wow, I really didn't need this thing. But you don't have that perspective until you've had all that. So
no.
I can see the wisdom in that, the adage of it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. So it's better to have accrued a lot of stuff and lost it than never to have accrued it, because then you don't know that you don't need it. You just
Yeah.
are always pining for these things or hoping for these things that you think are going to make your life better, but it really turns out it doesn't.
Yeah, well,
But you
I
can't tell
find that
somebody that it doesn't have it.
in your 20s and 30s, you feel that you need all this stuff. It's partly being successful. You've got this, you've got that. But the older you get, to realize the wisdom comes in and says, God, I haven't used that in 5 years. Or what? Yeah, you get rid of it and you downsize. And downsizing is a really good feeling because you feel, I only want what I need. I don't need all this stuff. It's the same thing with advertising. All of a sudden, all those advertising, it doesn't sink in because you think, no, I don't need that. I don't need that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you live very minimally. And it's kind of nice to live light and feel light. Because I remember I used to feel very burdened with all the stuff I had because I had to maintain it. And yeah.
Yeah. So with your voiceover work and book narration, how'd you get started into that?
When my wife and I finished our volunteering and backpacking, and we wrote our memoirs, we wrote the memoirs to encourage retirees to consider backpacking, having gone on holiday. People were saying, wow, you've got to be really wealthy with all that. And not at all. Not at all. We did it all on our pension. Didn't even touch our bank account. So we wrote a book called Budget Backpackers to show how you could do this. And then the other one is called Go For It, Volunteering Adventures on Roads Less Traveled. We're encouraging people, retirees, to consider volunteering, not necessarily internationally, but in their community. But we talked to a lot of people and said, wow. They say, well, you've lived 50 years, 60 years, you have acquired, whether you like it or not, knowledge and experience. And there's lots of people out there can use your talents. So that's why we wrote those books. But the books are all based on real happenings and whatever. So we put a 1 hour PowerPoint show together for each book. And then we went on the road to retirement residences, community centers, presenting these shows. So in doing that, we got a lot of experience in public speaking and just fine-tuning our presentations and whatever. Like we do one and they say, can you come back and do the next book? So we had 5 books, well, 4 books. So we ended up doing about 4 presentations at each venue. But that's when people said, you should put this into a book because I like audiobooks. So that's how I got into it. I did The Soldier and the Orphan first, and then I recorded Awakening in the Northwest Territories. So they're both available on Audible.
Okay. How did you like that process of creating that Audible audiobook?
Well, I liked it because in my books there's a lot of narration. So when I'm doing the recording, of course, I'm speaking, but I'm speaking what I dreamed up. So there's that weird thing that this is for real. I'm talking, yeah, that's weird. But I really enjoyed the process.
How long does it take you to do a book, to read one book and create the Audible for it?
Yeah. The books are about 10 hours long, so you can double it. It took about 20 hours of recording.
All right. And those are available on
Audible.
Audible? Okay.
Yeah.
And your books are available on Amazon and other places?
Sure, Barnes and Noble, and you can go into any bookstore and ask for it, and they're all clued in there. They can order it, but it's available on Kindle. There's an ebook on KDP, or a print book. Yeah.
What is the best way for people to follow your work?
Well, I would ask people to go to my website because my website has got a lot of information. So my website, very simply, is www.alastairhenry. And you have to watch the spelling because there's many ways to spell Alastair. But mine is ALASTAIR, Henry.com. And there you can read excerpts from my books. You can read reviews. There's a buy button. There's a thing on podcasts. All the podcast, and I will be adding this podcast to it so that if readers, if listeners want to, if they like the theme of the podcast, they'll click on it and listen to it. I've got something on there on home children, but that's part of the educational part of what I was doing to educate Canadians about the home children program.
Okay. Any thoughts in closing or things you wanted to talk about that we didn't?
No, I don't think so, Tia. I first of all thank you for the opportunity to share my books, my thoughts, and I've enjoyed the conversation. Yeah,
I did as well. Thank you very much for your time. And the links to, I think I have a Goodreads link, a Facebook link, and then your website that will be in the show notes so people can find it there if they're looking for it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I'll talk to you on the other side of this musical exit, but thank you very much for being here today.